Welcome back, everybody, to our studies in AQA A Level History. In this video, we're continuing talking about the origins of the Cold War, an examination of the history from 1945 to 1949. And specifically in this lesson, what I want to do is talk about the developments of conflict and how the developments of conflict concerned Germany. Now, conflict over Germany is one of those areas in which essentially we see the development of conflict between East and West. Specifically, this is a sort of heartland area where the two sides meet at the most obvious point. The Berlin Wall, for example, which we will see later on, is an illustration of this exact point that I'm trying to make here. We'll talk about the developments within each of the sections, the occupied areas, including the development of Bisonia, the idea of currency reform, and then the response to some of these developments, i.e. the Berlin blockade, the Berlin airlift, and the creation, finally, of East and West Germany. And we'll spend a little bit of time at the end talking about the formation of NATO. So it should just be noted that the period immediately following the Second World War, the end of the Second World War, was of course a very critical juncture. We can see that the way Europe looked after the Second World War compared to before the Second World War is very, very, very different. And in terms of the idea of occupation, the occupation of Germany, we can see that this is illustrated at the Potsdam Conference between the 17th of July and the 2nd of August 1945. So the occupation of Germany and its future are fully addressed and formally addressed at this conference. The leaders of the United States, the Soviet Union, and the United Kingdom all met to finalize the decisions that had been made earlier on in February at the Yalta Conference. The main difference between Yalta and Potsdam is the fact that with Yalta, there's a relatively strong amount of cordiality between all of the three leaders. You have Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill. And then at Potsdam, you have a very different situation because, of course, Roosevelt dies and is replaced by his vice president, Harry Truman. And in the summer of 1945, Winston Churchill is replaced in the general election by Labour Prime Minister Clement Attlee. So the world is a little bit different at Potsdam than what it was at Yalta, especially the relationship between Stalin and Truman. Truman, of course, viewing communism and viewing the Soviet Union with a lot more suspicion than that of his former president, that being Roosevelt. So we can see that the Potsdam Agreement led to a number of very key points, the first of which is, of course, the formal conclusion of the idea about occupation zones. Germany is divided into 4 occupation zones, each controlled by one of the major Allied powers. You have an American zone, a British zone, a French zone, and a Soviet zone. We also see demilitarization be a policy that is agreed upon. The state of Germany would be completely demilitarized, and its war industries would be dismantled to prevent any future military aggression. Now, when it came to the actual occupation zones, this dismantling of industries was actually used in the Soviet zone for the repayment of reparations to the Soviet Union. A program of denazification would also be implemented. The aim here is to remove Nazis from power and to essentially dismantle the Nazi infrastructure, as well as put a number of potential war criminals on trials, which is where we see the eventual London Charter and the establishment of the Nuremberg trials. And then finally, as I've just mentioned, the issue of reparations, of course, would be discussed at Potsdam. The Soviet Union, of course, extracted reparations from its zone in Germany. This was actually a slight point of contention, as the Western Allies wanted to ensure that Germany could recover economically, but Stalin was more concerned with the use of Germany's resources to try and rebuild the Soviet economy. And so when we think about the Potsdam Conference, while it was meant to be a collaborative framework, and theoretically on the surface there was a lot of agreement on what the post-war world would look like, there were still significant differences in how the Allies would envision, particularly Germany's future, for the purposes of this lesson and this conversation. The Soviet Union was seeking to extract as much from Germany as possible, and the communist friendly governments in the East, of course, would provide something of a buffer zone for the Soviet Union, while the Western Allies wanted to create a strong democratic Germany that would provide a new ally in Europe and a bulwark against the Soviet expansion into the West. So, in the immediate aftermath of the war, we can see that Germany was in a particularly important state of disarray. The company had been devastated by bombing raids from the Allied forces, and of course the formal invasion of Germany from both the East and the West. The population was suffering from hunger, displacement, and economic collapse. Unemployment was at vast levels. And when we look at this division into the different areas, when it came to Soviet policies in the Eastern zone, in Eastern Germany, don't forget these are not individual states at this point, they are just occupation zones, we can see the Soviet Union aimed to transform east part of Germany into a socialist state under Soviet influence. They extracted, as I've mentioned, as many resources as possible from in the form of reparations. And the Soviet authorities started to dismantle industrial facilities to send back to the USSR in order to rebuild the Soviet economy at the expense of the German economy. The land in the Soviet zone was also subjected to some forced collectivization policies, essentially where we see large estates being redistributed to peasants, many of whom were ideologically sympathetic to the Soviet cause, as you can probably imagine. Essentially, the implementation of the Soviet Union's economic policies that we see in the Soviet Union in the 1930s and the 1920s also applied in the occupied Germany. The Soviets had also implemented a one-party system in the East, led by the Socialist Unity Party, the SED. Now, this had been a party that was created by the forcible merger of two prior parties that existed in Germany. There was the Communist Party of Germany, the KPD, and the Social Democratic Party, the SPD. This was done in 1946. These two parties were merged together, and this created the Socialist Unity Party. While the Socialist Unity Party claimed to represent the so-called working class, it ultimately was under the control of Soviet agents and was aligned to the interests of Moscow. So whether or not it actually had any kind of benefit to the working classes, of course, would depend on whether or not that benefit also was a benefit to the agents working in Moscow. When it came to the Western zone, in contrast to the Soviet approach, you could probably imagine that they approached this issue very differently. We can see that the UK and the US and France saw economic recovery of Germany as a means to try and secure both long-term peace with Germany, but also long-term stability with Europe. We can see that they implement a number of aid programs, such as the Marshall Plan, to help rebuild not just Germany, a lot of other European economies. We talked about this in a previous lesson, but particularly when it came to Germany, ensuring that they would become a functioning capitalist economy. However, there was a growing divide in how Western allies saw the future of Germany. And so initially, the Western zones were governed separately. They were governed separately by Americans, British, and French. And so what ultimately happened is that if you imagine Germany, if you picture Germany in your head, you cut Germany in half, the eastern half becomes the Soviet-occupied area. And then the western half is divided further into three as well. One is British, one is American, one is French. So it is divided into four, but sort of not equally divided into four. It wasn't cut into quarters. It was cut one half in the Soviet Union side, and then three halves on the west. However, by 1947, the United States and the United Kingdom moved towards greater cooperation within their zones. It didn't make much sense to have three separate economies in one side and then a further separate economy on the other. This cooperation culminated in January 1947 with the creation of what is known as Bizonia. Now, Bizonia essentially combined the American and the British zones into one single economic unit. Initially, it was only the two, and then eventually Bizonia would incorporate the French zone as well. The goal of Bizonia was to try and stimulate economic recovery within the western zones of Germany, something that had been severely hampered by inflation and food shortages, and something that was not helped by having three separate economies that were operated by three different occupying forces. Now, from the perspective of the Soviet Union, the creation of Bizonia was ultimately the establishment of a unified German occupation zone in opposition to the eastern side that they were occupying, and so they opposed the creation of Bizonia, seeing it as an attempt by the West to create a separate, independent German state that was aligned to both the United States and the United Kingdom. The reason why this was problematic is because this was in direct contrast to the Soviet plans for the East, and it was also not something that was specified at either the Yalta Conference in February 1945 or the Potsdam Conference in July to August 1945. Within this period of time, then, we start to see a number of economic policies begin to develop. And there is a number of instances of conversation that we can talk about with regards to this particular conversation. The most critical moment in the occupation of Germany came when we see the introduction of a new currency in the western side. This was in June 1948. This was the creation of the Deutsche Mark, the new currency in Bizonia. Now, the intent of this currency was to essentially try and stabilize the West German economy. At the time, the West German economy was suffering from quite a significant amount of rampant inflation and lack of basic goods, and the introduction of the Deutsche Mark replaced the Reichsmark, which had become essentially worthless as the result of the inflation crisis taking place during the war and as a result of the war immediately afterwards. Now, the reason why this is problematic for Cold War tensions is because the Soviet Union was not fully consulted about this reform. And it viewed this reform as a deliberate move by the West to undermine the Soviet control over its zone. The introduction of the Deutsche Mark in Bizonia threatens the Soviet Union's position because it further entrenches the division between the Soviet zone and the Western zone. Now they are operating across two different currencies, further separating both East and West. The response by the Soviets was to blockade all road, rail, and water access to the Western zone. This results in, obviously, what is known as the Berlin blockade, which I will get to later on in this lesson. We'll talk about that in a minute. So, the currency reform, as we've just mentioned, concerns the establishment of Bizonia. It establishes the new currency itself. We can see that the intentions of the currency was clearly to stabilize the economy, to increase industrial output, but also there were ideological reasons for the combination of this new currency and the combination of these three occupied forces. And that ideological purpose was, of course, moving forward with currency reform without consulting the Soviet Union. The Western Allies made it very clear that they intended to have separate economic systems from the Soviets in the East. Now, In terms of executing such a reform, the Western Allies were led by the American monetary authority in Germany. The major monetary authority in Germany was Lucius D. Clay, who had moved quickly to implement new reforms across their zones. The reform was carried out in a single day, with people in the Western zone exchanging their old Reichsmarks for Deutsche Marks in a 1-to-1 ratio for up to 40% of their holdings, essentially incentivizing people to hand in all of their useless Reichsmarks and to get a fancy new currency as quickly as possible. The remaining old currency were exchanged at a highly disadvantageous rate, essentially devaluing the currency. Now, the currency reform for the western side of Germany did have immediate positive effects in that western zone. It ultimately reduces inflation, the rate of inflation, and consumer confidence begins to return. It also signals a move towards a more market capitalist economy in West Germany, which would eventually lead to the country's economic recovery. In fact, the economic recovery in West Germany is sometimes described as the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle that takes place within the period immediately after the establishment of this currency. Now, of course, we're not doing just German history, we're doing the history of the Cold War, so we're not going to spend too much time talking about the economic miracle and all these different kinds of things. We're talking about the impact that this had for the relations between all of these major superpowers. The reform was deeply contentious. The Soviet Union, which controlled the eastern part of Germany, had not been consulted about these currency changes, and so it saw these currency changes as a move to be a direct threat to its influence over Germany. The Soviets saw the introduction of the Deutsche Mark in the Western zones as a way to essentially solidify the separation between this East and West, and to undermine the idea of a unified Germany under a unified Allied control, signalling a clear division between these two major superpowers. And so, in response to the introduction of this Deutsche Mark, it led directly to the Berlin blockade. This was probably the first major crisis of the Cold War. While the Deutsche Mark introduction of the currency was partially done for Cold War ideological reasons, it also had genuine reasons that were for the purpose of establishing a better economy. The Berlin blockade, however, was a direct response to the establishment of the new currency and a clear dividing between East and West. So Berlin, although it had been located deep within the Soviet-controlled zone in Germany, had been, like I said in an earlier lesson, divided into 4 sections: the American, British, and French and Soviet. The sort of a similar kind of map of the occupation zones in Berlin applied to the country as a whole. Now, the Soviets viewed the introduction of the new currency as an attempt to create a separate economic and political system within West Germany. And they feared that such a reform would trigger a broader economic recovery in the Western zones, which would essentially cause the Eastern zones to lag behind and then cause a disparate economic separation between the East and West, which would mean unification would be even more difficult to do. This move, coupled with the growing militarization, and we'll talk about NATO in a minute, sees the establishment of the Berlin blockade. On the 24th of June 1948, in response to the currency reform, the Soviet Union blockaded all land and water routes into Berlin, effectively cutting off access to the city from the western zones. Now, the aim for this particular policy was to try and force the Western Allies to get out of Berlin, to abandon Berlin, allowing the Soviets to take full control of the city, which would not only be a major ideological success, because it would show the strength of the Soviet Union to have control not only of half of Germany, but also to have control of the entirety of the city's capital, and also to try and weaken the resolve of the Western powers by presenting them with this major challenge. And because ultimately this was the beginnings of the Cold War, the response from the Allies to the Berlin blockade was very, very important. How they responded in a way that was not directly confrontational, but in a way that did not weaken their resolve, that was the major goal that they had at this point. And so when we think about the Western response to the Berlin blockade, we get the Berlin airlift. This was a very quickly implemented plan that took place between June 1948 and May 1949, and the goal of the Berlin airlift was to supply West Berlin with food, fuel, and other essentials, bypassing the Soviet blockade. It became known as Operation Vitel's, as the aircraft was called by the Americans, and it became one of the most significant and most impressive logistical operations of the entire Cold War. Allies flew over 200,000 flights into West Berlin, delivering food, coal, medicine, and other supplies. Now, in my notes here, I've said that planes were landing every 90 seconds. I said in the previous lesson that planes were landing roughly every minute. I think it's more accurate. There's about every 90 seconds or so, a new plane was landing with, and more than 13,000 tons of supplies were delivered into the western part of Berlin on a daily basis. Now, that is an incredibly impressive logistical and humanitarian aid process. But it was not without its challenges, weather conditions and the Soviet threat of military retaliation, and just the purely logistical nightmare of getting such a policy off the ground, of course, would test the resolve of the Western powers. They had to not only supply enough goods to the Western Berliners to keep them satisfied, to keep them satiated essentially, but they also had to do so with the threat of a Soviet response, of Soviet military retaliation. So they had to sort of do it very, very carefully to make sure that they wouldn't start a third world war. But at the end of the day, the success of the airlift became a symbol of this Western determination and Western solidarity in the face of Soviet aggression. And over the course of nearly a year, more than 2.3 million tons of supplies would be delivered to Berlin. We see that initially the Soviet Union tried to pressure the Western Allies into trying to abandon West Berlin. That's what the Berlin blockade was. And they thought that the airlift wouldn't last very long and would eventually lead to the Westerners leaving Berlin. But ultimately, the Western powers maintained their position, and Stalin began in time to back down. The Soviets found it increasingly difficult to maintain the blockade without provoking more conflict. The Berlin airlift, if they were to attempt to try and stop that would be a direct confrontational attack on Western powers, which of course nobody wanted to do at this point. And so they also started to face mounting criticism for the hardship caused the population in the West. It wasn't a particularly popular idea. And so officially, on the 12th of May 1949, they officially ended the blockade and allowed traffic to resume back into West Berlin. It was a success for the West. It was a success for the Western Allies to essentially show the resolve of the Western powers in the face of the Soviet aggression. And it also, however, reinforced the division of Germany, with West Berlin and the surrounding Western zones remaining firmly under Allied control. The result then is the establishment of two separate states. At this point, it became clear that if there was going to be a state that emerges from this occupation, it would not be a single state. It could not be a single unified Eastern European Soviet-style state because the West would not allow it, and it would not be a Western-style capitalist state because the East would not allow it. So if there was going to be a state that emerges out of these occupations, it would have to be two. There would have to be at least two states established. And that's what we see. In May 1949, the Western Allies formally created the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, and in response, in October 1949, we see the establishment of the German Democratic Republic, East Germany. The Berlin blockade and the airlift also had long-lasting effects on European security and the global balance of power. the Soviet Union felt humiliated by this particular incident, the failure to force the Allies out of Berlin, and so it turns its attention to other parts of Europe. In response to the establishment of NATO, which we'll get to in the next slide, in 1955, the Soviet bloc establishes the Warsaw Pact. Meanwhile, we see the United States and its allies strengthening their commitment to containing Soviet influence, something we'll get to in future lessons' time. I want to just finally think about the formation of NATO very, very quickly at the end, because of course we'll talk about NATO and we'll talk about these military alliances more and more and more. Its establishment is not particularly controversial. In 1949, the Western powers establishes NATO. NATO stands for North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and it was a military alliance designed to counter Soviet aggression and to provide a collective defense pact against attack on its member states. So famously, within the charter for NATO, there is Article 5 of the NATO Treaty. The NATO Treaty Article 5 makes it very, very clear that an attack on one is an attack on all, such that if you're a member of NATO and you are attacked by the Soviet Union, as it would have been in the Cold War, it would represent an attack on every member of NATO. And so that would it would necessitate a response from every single other member state, which essentially meant that what you were doing is if you wanted to attack, I don't know, West Berlin, or France, or a smaller country that is a member of NATO. If we talk about today, for example, when we've got even smaller countries like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, if you wanted to attack one of those countries, that would represent an attack on every single NATO member, including the UK, including France, including Canada, and most importantly, including the United States. As we start to see time go on and the conversation about nuclear warfare becomes more and more important, we see that groups like NATO and the Warsaw Pact, which, as I said, was established in 1955, they become what are known as nuclear umbrellas. It becomes essentially a way to dissuade people from facilitating the establishment of their own nuclear weapons programs, because why would I need a nuclear weapons program of my own and try and use my own nuclear weapons as a country when all I need to do is be a part of NATO? Because if then a country attacks me, then I have at my disposal the entire NATO alliance, including the United States, France, and Great Britain, all of whom have nuclear weapons themselves. And so that dissuades countries and leads to a greater amount of nuclear non-proliferation, the sort of reduction of nuclear weapons, the halting of nuclear weapons programs. And we do see it works. So as a tiny tangent before the end of this lesson, we do see that it works. The number of countries that have nuclear weapons has actually gone down in time. Famously, South Africa used to have nuclear weapons, and they disbanded with their nuclear armaments programs. And so the number of nuclear weapons as well in the world has also declined too in recent years. So these kinds of things are very important, not only for the time in 1949, but also in terms of today, with non-proliferation of nuclear weapons being of such paramount importance.